Nathan had always believed that chemistry was the one part of life that made sense. Equations balanced. Reactions followed rules. If you respected the formulas rewarded you with certainty. That was why he spent long hours at the lab table, pages of carefully written notes stacked neatly beside him, every chemical symbol marked in perfect handwriting. His professors trusted him. His classmates relied on him for explanations. To Nathan, the laboratory was not just a classroom. It was his sanctuary. He wore his reputation as the chemist nerd without shame. In his mind, it was better to be mocked for caring too much than to float through life caring about nothing. Lucas was the opposite in every possible way. Where Nathan was orderly, Lucas was chaos. His grades were a disaster, his attendance barely acceptable, and when he did show up, it was with a smirk that dared the teachers to challenge him. He leaned back in his chair, chewing gum while the rest of the class scrambled to copy equations from a board. He never brought his own lab coat, always borrowing one from the back of the room, sleeves rolled up as if mocking the seriousness of the environment. For Lucas, science was a joke. It was just another hour to survive until the day was over, another chance to poke fun at the people who actually cared. And then came the announcement. The professor, tired of students coasting through the semester, decided that the final laboratory project would be completed in pairs, randomly assigned pairs. The results would determine nearly half of the final grade. Silence swept through the room as names were read out. Some students smiled at their luck, others groaned. Nathan sat upright, hopeful for someone who could at least keep up with his pace. He could already see the project taking shape in his mind. Neat data tables, clean glassware, precise results. He prayed for a partner who would not drag him down. But when the professor called his name, the second name that followed was Lucas. The classroom reacted instantly. A ripple of laughter, whispers, a few heads turning to watch Nathan's expression. Everyone knew what kind of student Lucas was. Everyone also knew how seriously Nathan took his work. It was the worst possible combination, and the tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Nathan froze, his pen hovering above his notebook. He forced himself to stay calm, to show nothing, but inside his stomach tightened. For him, this wasn't just inconvenient. It was catastrophic. This project mattered. His grades mattered. His future depended on the impression he made in classes like this. And now, half of that grade rested on the shoulders of a boy who barely even knew what experiment they were supposed to be running. Lucas, on the other hand, grinned like he had just won something. He leaned back in his chair, stretched his arms, and looked straight at Nathan with the kind of smile designed to irritate. "Guess we're partners, genius," he said loud enough for half the class to hear. The words carried a sting, not because of the insult itself, but because of the way Lucas made it sound like a game. For Lucas, this was entertainment. He could already imagine how frustrated Nathan would become, how easy it would be to get under his skin. To Lucas, being assigned to the school's most serious student wasn't a punishment. It was a chance to amuse himself at Nathan's expense. Nathan's jaw tightened. He wrote something in his notebook just to have an excuse not to look at Lucas. His face remained calm, but his thoughts burned. Why him? Why now? Of all the possible partners, he had been given the one person least likely to take this seriously. It wasn't just a matter of inconvenience. It felt like sabotage. The professor's voice continued, calling out the rest of the names, but Nathan barely heard them. His focus was on the reality pressing down on him. He and Lucas would share a lab bench, share the responsibility, share the outcome. And if Lucas refused to work, if he made a mess of things, then Nathan's future would pay the price. The bell rang, and students began to shuffle out, buzzing about their pairings. Nathan remained seated, still processing. Lucas, of course, was the last to stand. He slung his backpack over one shoulder, walked past Nathan's desk, and tapped him lightly on the notebook with 2 fingers. "Don't worry, Professor," Lucas said with exaggerated seriousness. "I'll make sure we get an A." The sarcasm was obvious, the grin careless, but the effect was sharp. Nathan felt the eyes of classmates still lingering on them, waiting to see his reaction. He said nothing, only closed his notebook and slipped it into his bag with slow precision. But the silence spoke louder than any words. Lucas laughed and walked away, leaving Nathan alone at the desk. For Nathan, the laughter wasn't just irritating, it was a promise. A promise that this partnership would not be simple. A promise that every hour in the lab would be a test, not of chemistry, but of patience, discipline, and control. The stage was set. The chemist who believed in order had been chained to the rebel who thrived on disorder. And both knew, even from that first moment, that the laboratory would not be big enough to contain the clash that was coming. The laboratory smelled of chemicals and metal, the air heavy with the faint bite of alcohol burners and disinfectant. Rows of students bent over their glassware, scribbling results or whispering hurriedly to each other. At one particular bench, however, the tension was palpable from the very start. Nathan had laid out everything with careful precision. Clean beakers, freshly labeled flasks, neatly aligned pipettes. His notebook was open to a crisp page, pen poised to record every observation the instant it occurred. He had already rehearsed the procedure twice in his mind, confident that with accuracy and discipline they would reach the expected result. For him, this was not just an assignment. It was proof of his reliability, his dedication, perhaps even his future in the world of science. Lucas arrived late, as if to emphasize how little he cared. His lab coat hung half-buttoned, his goggles dangled carelessly from one hand, and he carried himself with the casual swagger of someone who knew he was already testing Nathan's patience. He dropped his bag onto the floor, leaned against the bench, and glanced at the equipment with exaggerated confusion. "So, Professor," he said mockingly, "what magical potion are we brewing today?" His grin widened when Nathan's jaw clenched, though the other boy did not answer. The experiment began, and the clash between them was immediate. Nathan measured the chemicals with steady, practiced hands, carefully counting the drops as they slid into the flask. Lucas, meanwhile, tapped a pencil against the table in a restless rhythm, making jokes about explosions, pretending to reach for the wrong substance just to see Nathan's expression tighten. "Relax, genius," Lucas whispered loud enough for others nearby to hear. "It's not like we're building a bomb." Laughter from the next bench made Nathan's ears burn, but he kept working, determined not to give Lucas the satisfaction of a reaction. Still, Lucas pushed harder. When Nathan asked him to record the temperature, Lucas deliberately wrote the wrong number, grinning when Nathan snatched the thermometer back with obvious frustration. When it came time to stir the mixture, Lucas swirled it recklessly, splashing a few drops onto the bench. "It's chemistry," he said, shrugging. "It's supposed to look dangerous." Nathan snapped at last. His voice, usually quiet, rose above the clatter of glass. "If you don't care about this, then get out of the way. Some of us actually want to learn." The outburst silenced the nearby chatter for a moment. Lucas leaned back, lips curling into a half-smile, but his eyes narrowed in something darker than amusement. For once, Nathan had struck a nerve. The professor glanced their way, but did not intervene. Perhaps he expected them to resolve it themselves, or perhaps he was curious to see which of them would break first. Nathan returned to the experiment with stiff movements, furious that his concentration had been shattered. But then something shifted. Lucas no longer smirked. He no longer cracked jokes. Instead, he stared at the swirling liquid in the flask with an expression that was almost absent, as if he were somewhere else entirely. "Do you know why I messed things up?" Lucas said suddenly, his voice low enough that only Nathan could hear. Nathan frowned, caught off guard, but Lucas continued without waiting for an answer. "Because if I don't, no one looks at me. I'm just no one. Noise is easier than silence. Silence means nobody cares you're even there." His tone was stripped of sarcasm, and for the first time Nathan saw no performance in his face, only exhaustion. The words unsettled him. He had always assumed Lucas was simply lazy, careless, someone who thrived on provoking others. But the confession cracked the mask wide open. Nathan saw not the Hulk of rebellion, but a boy who feared emptiness, who fought loneliness with laughter and recklessness. It was disarming, confusing, even dangerous, because it stirred something Nathan did not expect to feel: recognition. The flask bubbled softly between them, releasing faint vapors that curled into the air. Nathan did not answer immediately, but his silence was different now. It was not the silence of contempt. It was the silence of listening. Lucas tapped the bench with his fingers again, though this time the rhythm was softer, uncertain. "You think I don't care about this class," he muttered, "but maybe I just don't know how to care without looking like a fool. Everyone expects me to be the idiot, so I give them what they want." Nathan's hand hovered over his notebook, unsure whether to continue writing data or to look directly at the boy who had just revealed more in a few sentences than he ever had in months of noisy bravado. For a moment, the experiment was forgotten. The true reaction was not in the glassware, but between them, a volatile mixture of order and chaos, precision and recklessness, silence and noise. And for the first time, Nathan wondered whether the most dangerous formula in the room was not the one they were working on, but the one building invisibly between them. The weeks that followed were almost surreal. Against every prediction, Nathan and Lucas began to work as something resembling a team. Their experiments, once a battlefield of spilled liquids and sarcastic remarks, slowly started producing clean results. Nathan noticed that Lucas stopped making deliberate mistakes. He measured more carefully, asked occasional questions, even scribbled down notes when he thought no one was looking. For Nathan, this was both a relief and a shock. He had expected sabotage. Instead, he found unexpected cooperation. It wasn't perfect. Lucas still cracked jokes, still leaned back in his chair as though he owned the room. But beneath the bravado, he was actually trying. And for reasons Nathan could not fully explain, that mattered. Their results caught the professor's attention first. One afternoon, he paused by their bench, inspecting the neatly aligned data sheets and the steady color change in their latest solution. "Good work," he said simply before moving on. It was just 2 words, but they carried weight. For Nathan, it was validation. For Lucas, it was something else entirely, acknowledgement from someone who usually looked at him with little more than suspicion. Nathan caught a flicker of pride in Lucas's eyes before it was quickly hidden beneath a grin. But the acknowledgement also drew the attention of others. Whispered comments began to circulate in the lab, growing louder with each passing day. It started as teasing remarks tossed carelessly across the benches. "Look at that. The genius finally tamed the delinquent." Maybe Lucas found a brain to borrow. Laughter would follow, light and cruel at the same time. At first, Nathan tried to ignore it. He told himself it was harmless, the usual noise of classmates who thrived on gossip. But soon the remarks sharpened. "Boughton and the failure. What a pair." One voice jeered during cleanup, and the phrase stuck. Every time they walked into the lab together, someone whispered it, sometimes loud enough for them both to hear, sometimes disguised as a joke to others. Nathan could feel the heat of it on his skin. He hated attention, hated the way their names were suddenly tied together in mockery. Yet he endured it because he believed the work mattered more. If they stayed focused, the results would silence the laughter. He convinced himself Lucas felt the same. After all, Lucas had kept showing up, had kept trying. Surely he wouldn't let the gossip matter. But Nathan underestimated the weight of reputation. One afternoon, the tension reached its breaking point. Their experiment had gone smoother than ever, the solution perfectly balanced, the numbers lining up exactly as the manual described. For the first time, Nathan allowed himself to feel almost proud, to imagine that maybe this partnership could end without disaster. He looked at Lucas, ready to share the small victory. But before he could speak, a voice cut through the air from the back of the room. "Hey, look at them. The brainiac and the clown. What a romantic couple of science." Laughter exploded. Chairs scraped as students leaned to watch, their grins wide, their voices carrying more venom than amusement. Nathan froze, his pen still in hand, the weight of every eye burning into his back. The laughter wasn't just mocking. It was dissecting, tearing apart the fragile progress he and Lucas had built. Lucas stiffened beside him. For a moment, Nathan thought he saw the same discomfort, the same sting that he himself felt. He waited for Lucas to brush it off, maybe even to defend the work they had done together. Instead, Lucas laughed, louder than anyone else. He leaned back, raised his voice so the whole room could hear, and said, Don't get it twisted. I'm not actually working with him. He just likes doing everything himself. I let him because why not? Saves me the trouble." The words hit harder than any insult Nathan had ever endured. They landed like a physical blow, cutting through the fragile trust that had been forming. The class roared with amusement, satisfied by the performance. Lucas smirked, his mask perfectly in place again, as though the long hours of shared effort had been nothing but an act. Nathan felt his chest tighten, but he forced his face in his stillness. He wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing pain. Yet inside, everything collapsed. It wasn't just the laughter of the class that broke him. It was Lucas's choice. Lucas had chosen the crowd, chosen the safety of mockery over the fragile truth they had shared in whispers during the quiet moments of their work. For Nathan, it was betrayal in its purest form. The boy who had admitted he feared silence had just used noise to erase everything they had built. And no amount of chemistry, no balance of equations, could fix the fracture that split open between them in that instant. The silence between them lasted for weeks. In a laboratory, they spoke only about measurements and results, voices clipped and formal, as if all that had existed before was an illusion. Lucas kept his mask firmly in place, cracking jokes with others, playing the role of the rebel who cared about nothing. Nathan buried himself in notes, refusing to look at him for longer than necessary. To anyone watching, they were just another pair of students forced together by circumstance, strangers sharing a bench, nothing more. But beneath that surface lay a tension so thick it poisoned every hour, every glance, every unspoken word. The betrayal weighed on Nathan more than the laughter of the class. He could endure the mockery of strangers, but Lucas's dismissal had cut deeper than he wanted to admit. At night, as he stared at the pages of his textbooks, he found himself replaying the moment over and over. The smirk, the careless words, the way Lucas had chosen the crowd instead of the fragile trust they had been building. It had left him with a hollow ache that formulas could not fill. Then one evening, when the campus was quiet and most students had already drifted back to their dorms, there was a knock at his door. It was hesitant, almost reluctant, the kind of knock that suggested the person behind it wasn't sure whether he should even be there. Nathan opened it, and there stood Lucas. No grin, no sarcastic remark ready on his lips, just a face that looked strangely unguarded. For a long moment, neither spoke. Finally, Lucas ran a hand through his hair, exhaled sharply, and said, "I can't keep doing this." His voice was low, raw, carrying none of the confidence he usually wore like armor. Nathan frowned, unsure what he meant, and waited. Lucas stepped into the room, shutting the door behind him as though afraid the hallway might overhear. "All that stuff I do," Lucas continued, gesturing vaguely, "the clown, the troublemaker, the guy who doesn't care. It's all fake. It's exhausting. Every day I wake up and I know I have to wear it again, because it's what everyone expects. And the truth is," he hesitated, his voice faltering before he forced it out. "The truth is I'm not scared of silence. I'm scared of myself. Scared that if I stop playing the part, there'll be nothing worth seeing underneath." The words hung heavy in the air. Nathan felt his chest tighten, not with anger this time, but with something harder to name. He had imagined Lucas's bravado was endless, that his arrogance was unshakable. To see him stripped of it was disorienting. It was like watching a mask crack, revealing someone almost unrecognizable. "I push you away," Lucas said, his eyes fixed on the floor. "That day in the lab, I thought if I laughed with them, if I pretended we weren't whatever we were, then maybe I could keep my place. Keep the stupid reputation. But it didn't make me feel safe. It just made me feel empty. And I hate myself for it." His voice roughened, as though the words themselves scraped on the way out. "I don't want to hide anymore. Not from them. Not from you. Not from myself." Nathan swallowed hard, torn between disbelief and something dangerously close to hope. He wanted to believe, but the wound was still fresh. Trust was not so easily rebuilt. "And what happens," he asked quietly, "when they laugh again? Well, the whole class turns on you for good." Lucas finally looked up, and in his eyes was no performance, no arrogance, only a raw determination edged with fear. "Then let them. I'd rather lose everything than go back to pretending. The silence that followed was electric, charged with risk and possibility. Nathan's instinct was to retreat, to protect himself from being hurt again. But the sincerity in Lucas's voice, the exhaustion in his posture, the absence of the ever-present smirk, it all felt real in a way nothing else had. For the first time, Nathan wasn't looking at the rebel or the troublemaker. He was looking at someone who had been carrying a weight too heavy for too long. He did not answer immediately. He let the silence stretch, not as punishment, but as acknowledgement of what had just been said. And then, slowly, he nodded. The final presentation of their laboratory project arrived sooner than Nathan expected. Weeks of work, long evenings of data collection, and repeated trials, all condensed into a single report and a demonstration in front of the class. Nathan had rehearsed every detail, his notes stacked neatly, equations balanced to perfection. What he had not rehearsed was the strange calm he now felt working beside Lucas. There was no bravado at the bench that day, no smirking interruptions, only a steady presence. Lucas handed over glassware when asked, adjusted the flame when it flickered too high, even recorded numbers without complaint. It was as if the mask he had once clung to had finally fallen away. When the professor inspected their results, his eyes narrowed, then softened with something close to approval. "Excellent work," he said, setting their papers down with a definitive nod. "One of the strongest submissions this semester." The word struck Nathan like a sudden warmth, but it was Lucas's reaction that lingered. He didn't grin or joke. Instead, he allowed himself a small, quiet smile, subdued, almost private. For once, he looked like he believed he deserved the praise. But if the professor's recognition was a victory, the reaction from their classmates was something else entirely. Whispers rippled through the lab, sharp and cutting. Guess the clown finally turned into a teacher's pet. So much for the bad boy. Some students laughed openly, the same ones who once cheered Lucas's antics. Others turned away, their faces laced with mockery or disappointment, as though his success had betrayed them. Lucas heard all. The jeers, the jokes, the subtle rejection. He could have answered with a sneer, could have cracked another joke to win them back. But he didn't. He stood still, his jaw tightening, his hands resting quietly on the bench. For the first time, he let the laughter pass without feeding it. Nathan noticed the shift immediately. Lucas was losing the only currency he had ever held, the approval of the crowd. His so-called friends who had followed him to parties and laughed at his rebellions now drifted away. In the cafeteria, they sat at different tables. In the corridors, their greetings turned into smirks. It was a slow, deliberate exile, the stripping away of a reputation he had once worn like armor. And yet, strangely, Lucas did not collapse under it. He did not run back to the mask. He seemed lighter, tired, yes, bruised by the isolation, but no longer bound to the performance that had once consumed him. Nathan saw it in the way he walked into the lab without theatrics, in the way he leaned quietly against the wall instead of demanding attention. He saw it in the way Lucas looked at him, not for an audience, not for show, but directly, as though their connection was the only thing left untouched by judgment. For Nathan, this was more than surprising. It was unsettling. All his life, he had survived by avoiding attention, by hiding in silence. Now here was Lucas, willingly discarding the attention he once thrived on. They had met as opposites, but somewhere between failure and betrayal, chaos and order, they had collided into something different. Something neither of them had planned for. Of course, the world did not make it easy. Rumors spread, the same cruel voices whispering in corners, mocking their partnership. The nerd and the failure still together. Guess opposites really do attract. Every word was designed to sting, to force them back into roles the others understood. But Nathan and Lucas no longer reacted the way they once had. Nathan didn't shrink from the attention, and Lucas didn't drown it out with noise. They endured it in silence, standing side by side, unshaken by the storm outside their fragile truce. It was not perfection. Nathan still craved order, still built his world on rules and formulas. Lucas still wrestled with his impulses, still longed sometimes for the laughter that no longer followed him. But in their differences, they had found something that felt stronger than either solitude or performance. Nathan discovered that silence shared with someone who understood it was not a prison, but a refuge. Lucas discovered that living without a mask was terrifying, but also liberating. The world judged, whispered, laughed, but for the first time, neither of them asked for its permission. What they had was fragile, perhaps temporary, but it was real. And in that reality, they both tasted a freedom that neither had ever known.